As you may or may not know, every single year there are tons of reports of sightings, encounters, altercations with what everybody knows as Bigfoot or Sasquatch. This particular one has never been told before, according to the person that sent it in to me. This unbelievable experience happened in an area in Alaska known as the Gates of the Arctic. It is a designated wilderness area, and as far as designated wilderness areas go in the United States, it is the number 3 as far as size, at 7+ million acres. The person that sent this encounter in, let's just call him Gary, has told me that the reason he's not worried at this point about giving specific locations is this was so long ago. It happened in 2005. He's not concerned that anybody's going to be going around there snooping in the same area and disrupting the lives of these beings in this designated wilderness area that is almost 11,000 square miles. Is it any wonder that somebody could go missing in a place like that? Is it any wonder that somebody could see something unusual in a place like that? Gary and his wife have frequented many desolate and relatively unexplored areas. And they've lived in Wyoming, Montana, and now they reside in Alaska. Back in 2005, he and his wife had decided to go on a nice little family camping trip with his niece and nephew in a cabin that he had borrowed from a friend. Obviously, this sounds like something out of a movie, but realistically, who wouldn't jump at the chance for such an adventure? I mean, a cabin in the woods in Alaska? I'm sold. The subject of Bigfoot has been ingrained in American culture so long. They had jokingly popped off with a few things like, hey, maybe we can see a Bigfoot. But according to Gary, his wife didn't want any part of that kind of talk, not even jokingly. He said, if I would have known what was going to happen, I never would have joked at all. On the evening of March 6th, Gary and his family had just started to pack their things when their plans experienced a little bit of a hiccup. The cabin that they were originally going to stay in unfortunately had a leak. So they had all but thrown their plans on the back burner at this point. But luckily, or maybe unluckily, depending on how you look at it, his friend came up with another one last minute. Not exactly a cabin, but close enough. 4 walls and a roof was all they really cared about at this point. They made a few arrangements and took off. On March 7th, they arrived at their destination. Gary said that literally as soon as they got there, he and his wife had an uneasy feeling, like something just wasn't right. On the very first night, their nightmare had already begun. They heard 2 loud, percussive knocks on the east side of their house. This made them practically fall out of their seats, and his wife started screaming, and he had to cover her mouth up. They were all terrified. What could be way out there, first of all, and second of all, what could shake the walls just by knocking? Surprisingly, the niece and nephew were almost silent. One of them suggested, hey, maybe a branch fell down, or maybe a couple rocks slid down the hill and hit the side of the house. Yeah, you're probably right, is what he said, because honestly, he wanted to believe it, and he was also trying to keep the kids calm. But in their hearts, the adults knew something bad was going on. The rest of that night was almost drama-free. They did hear some noises, but eventually they were able to get some sleep. The next morning, they did muster up the courage to go out and explore around looking for any signs of anything. Well, nothing. Not a single sign of anything at first, except for one very strange finding that baffled them. It looked like 2 very large stones were near the house originally, but had been removed. No sign of them anywhere. If any person or anything moved them, they would have to be very strong. Gary made the observation that these things hadn't been rolled, they hadn't been moved in any sort of a way that would leave a marking on the ground. They were picked straight up and carried off. At least that's the way it looked. One thing I want to mention myself right now, at some point every story is brand new. It may make its rounds around the internet or around the world eventually, maybe it won't. But I think we need to be open-minded to the fact that any of these stories can be true, not just some of them. That next day they had a lot of fun. They tried to take their mind off the experience that they had the night before and just enjoy their stay. But as night fell, it was inevitable that some level of tension and dread would build up within them. And as it turns out, for good reason. They had made themselves some stew and they were playing board games, but each person was unable to act totally natural. They just couldn't suppress that feeling that they were thinking inside, what if something happens again tonight? As they were quietly trying to enjoy themselves, that's when the next part started in. The first creature made its presence known with no subtlety. There was an explosive and sudden vocalization, followed up immediately by what Gary described as very monkey-like whoops. Their terror was right back where it started. this time amplified by the idea that maybe these things were stalking them. All these thoughts started going through their minds, like, how close are these things to the house? What are their intentions? Another question they all had was, how many were there? A question that would never fully be answered, but that night, they all agreed that they heard at least 3. The vocalizations were accompanied now by bangs on the side of the house, so things were getting worse, fast. Gary wanted to go outside and try to do something. He was just so mad. It was like his fight or flight kicked in and he chose fight. But his wife pleaded with him not to go outside. Don't do it, she said. She just screamed at him, don't do it. He did everything he could to regain his composure, but he just started screaming, "What do you want?" at the top of his lungs. Unfortunately, this only seemed to excite them and make the vocalizations even more extreme and aggressive. At one point, his nephew started screaming too and said he saw one of these things go by the window and claimed it looked like a giant monkey. Well, of course, this only served to make everyone's morale even worse and put everyone even more on edge. On the inside, they were all starting to get this idea that they knew what they were dealing with: Bigfoot. For that entire night, they were terrorized, and they got the feeling that it was very much a territory claim type of thing, just letting them know, hey, you're in our area, get out. But of course, they were entirely too frightened to just leave. They didn't want to see these creatures, much less deal with them, so they felt the best course of action is just to stay inside. You may be asking yourself, why didn't they just leave during the day? Well, there is a reason. Gary's truck is 4-wheel drive, but there had been new snowfall and it was a little bit more treacherous than when they got there. He didn't want to take the chance of getting stuck out there and then boom, you're even more exposed to these creatures. He would have called somebody, but he didn't think anybody would believe his story. I mean, can you imagine calling somebody and saying, hey, can you come get us on this crazy dangerous road because Bigfoot is after us? It's hard to say what anybody would do in such a traumatizing situation. And most people don't have the ability to function at high levels or make impeccable decisions under such stress. Gary's family didn't have any sort of protection, and what he told me is he felt like even if he had, he still would have been at a great disadvantage. You know, the chances that he would be able to defend them was not even a sure thing, even if they had sufficient weaponry. During the day, he and his wife brainstormed on what to do. She wanted to leave, but again, he felt that was too risky. The kids they kept out of the conversation. They didn't want to upset them even more. All they came up with was maybe stay completely silent if something happened again. They reasoned that since they screamed last time, if they stay completely quiet this time, maybe that will be taken as a sign of strength instead of a sign of weakness. They decided it was worth a shot and they would give it a go. That evening, when they finished with dinner, they all sat around reading, only because they had to do something. After all, a person copes any way they can. They got a slight reprieve until about 2 a.m. This is when they were all awakened by shrill screams and distant thumping noises. They all sat up, silent and looking down, none of them wanting to even look at each other. The vocalizations just started getting louder, shorter, and closer. Eventually, things took a turn for the worse. The family was plagued with their most intense assault yet. Continuous banging and screaming, and very loud, aggressive growls and howls and grunts. Gary said he specifically remembers the walls actually shaking and dust falling down from the light. He said it was just absolutely horrible, like they were dead set on getting some sort of a reaction out of us. It was all we could do, but we kept totally quiet. But looking back, I don't think it helped. It may have actually agitated them more, but we wanted to stick to the plan, and this went on for hours. It was just absolutely mentally exhausting, but they made it through, and they said, thankfully, they didn't actually try to get in. Morning couldn't come soon enough for their family, but the hardest thing for them to deal with was knowing what those kids had to go through. Kids can be very resilient, of course, but as the adults that were supposed to be protecting them, it tore us up inside. Finally, dawn came, and that gave them a slight sense of safety. He said they all slept in very, very late. During that day, Gary went and checked the road, and he believed it was getting much better, and maybe by the next day they would try to get out of there if at all possible. But as for that coming night, they all had the feeling that they were in for one last show of aggression, and they were right. It started relatively early, about 9:45 p.m., and in a last-ditch effort to try something new, Gary started screaming back. He started just pounding on the walls, and he instructed everybody else to join in. And sick of being victims, they all decided to give these creatures a dose of their own medicine. They all banged and screamed and howled for all they were worth. And this actually seemed to work. There would be periods of several minutes where there would be no sound outside. They kept this technique up for the entire night, but the tenacity of these beings was unreal. This assault went on for 5+ hours. But then, very abruptly, this show of territorial aggression ceased. Poof, nothing. Their bravery seemed to pay off, as no harm came to them, except for emotional damage, of course. When morning came, they were totally ready to walk out that door. When they bolted for that truck, Gary's wife says she looked up at a hill nearby, and one of these huge, hairy ape men was standing there staring at her. And she said that was the confirmation that we all needed to know that that's what we were dealing with. This was for sure Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti, whatever you choose to call it. She says the picture of that in her mind still gives her chills to this day. Can't exactly blame her. Gary says that was the end of our nightmare. We were able to, without too much trouble, navigate those roads and get back to our normal lives. Or should I say, back to our forever changed lives. We went through a lot of personal trials on how to deal with this situation. As you might expect, it's very difficult and very complicated. But we wanted to share it. We felt like we had enough time and distance from that situation now that it was just time to air it out. He says it is what it is, it's over, and they're okay, and that's what matters. Gary wanted me to add extra emphasis to this last part. Gary's message to all of you is simply this. Believe it or not, that's your choice. But just do him this one favor. When you go in the woods, be careful. Take care. Well guys, that is a wrap on this one. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. So until next time, I'll see you later.